He looks at me and says, "What a what?" But within him is a bottomless abyss because he harbors deep inside the secret yearning, one that stops his beating breast. He talks, and his words ring true, but the tainted with the hollow sadness. Valiantly he braves the storm and prays to God for the penance. The torturous pain of love at all burns painfully refuses to be born until the mate in the body for the sun has set to be the natural sun. If the sun is to rise from the east, the came and went as it pleased, would understand Japan's flight, and compassion would make you fast flight. Be bold and carry your good pride, and never mind into what to scout in admiration is a thing of trouble. So smile, accord time, and say, wow, that's a poem from a poem that was written for me. My friend Daniel Mehaji in third year, I think, at Mac University, who both students excellent me. He wrote that poem for me and he gave it to me. For me in class, like, threw it to the paper into my hand, and then I opened it, opened it to the poem. And I was impressed by that. I was impressed that he could write poetry of that beauty, and also impressed that he understood my situation so accurately. So, uh, when I wrote this book, Just as Joe, I reproduced that exact poem uh, in the book. I reproduced exactly the way Daniel had written it. I didn't change anything. You can see, I don't know the comment is, but it's exactly it in this page. You find that that is exactly uh, the poem that I just read. And I mentioned Dan's name, his real name. There are only two people in the book whose real names I mentioned. One is Dan, and the reason why I mentioned his real name is that I wanted to acknowledge the authorship of that poem because whereas I wrote the rest of this book, that poem was written by Dan, and I wanted to give him credit. So I have no way out of mentioning his real name. The other person whose name I mentioned is Professor Bob Richardson. He was a head of department at that time, and he was a lecturer as well. So he features a little bit in the book, uh, and I use his own name. But the people that write the book who are in real life, I invented false names for them. Uh, Now, people usually ask me how much of this is joy is real, how much of it is true, how much is fiction. As you can see from the case of Dan's poetry, there are some parts of the book that are actually true because Dan wrote a poem and it appears in the book and it's mentioned in the book which is written by Dan. So suddenly, yeah, there are parts of the book that are taken from real life. But uh, the the extent to which the book is an autobiography, the extent to which the book is autobiographical, I don't think being overstated or being overestimated by so many readers and viewers. The first person to read the book was October 2007. It was Patience Atuhire. She was a columnist in Sunday Monitor at the time. She had a column called Master Reads, and it was in that column that she reviewed this book called, my first novel. This was my first novel. And one of the things that I remember from the preview it was that, she was saying that I had met the character to tell a story that sounded very much like my own. To tell a story that sounded very much like my own. And Patience I've never met her. I've never met her up to now. And she had never met me. She didn't know anything about me. She didn't know anything about my race. So that's what I'm saying. She didn't know what my race story actually was. But she was saying that just a story sounds like my story. So I found that a bit interesting because uh, how can you know that the story sounds like the author's story when you don't know the author's story. Uh, but yeah, I guess there's something about the way the story is told that probably get someone to think that this must be a true story. And someone else that who's commented for the interesting was Josepha. Josepha, I used to work with a magazine called Inspiration. You know, from 2000 to 2008, I published a magazine called Inspiration, and she was one of the contributors. And when Josepha read this book, she uh, asked me, because of a phone conversation, she asked me, "How is your wife?" And I was a bit confused. So I asked her, "What do you mean, my wife?" And she was like, "You mean you didn't marry that girl?" So I got to understand what she meant. I got to understand what she meant. Sylvia, the girl that I just gets married to in just a year. Well, obviously, that part of Sylvia is fiction. And then, Umar just told you about that wrote that poem that I had at the beginning. When he read the book, he told me it's a good story, but you need to make Chiwani way. At that time, Chiwani had become a popular word because Bobby Wine just released a song called Chiwani. You know, Chiwani, 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 Chiwani. So it was like a word that people were using a lot at that time. And Daniel was basically telling me that I had told the true story and then spoiled at the end with a falsehood, that falsehood about Sylvia. But the thing is, it's not just Sylvia that is a falsehood. Everything in this book, it's a mix of fact and fiction because I can tell you something else about my little brother, my young brother, about 7 years my junior. He asked me once after reading the book, he asked me that I don't remember. He didn't ask me. He told me. I don't remember Helen. So I got a bit confused for a while, but then I realized he actually believed that Helen had been a real person. That she had been somebody that had probably been part of our family when he was maybe a toddler or an infant. He didn't realize that Helen actually never existed. So that is what I'm telling you. Everything in this book, Helen never existed. Miranda, Miranda maybe just about 3% existed. Uh, Sylvia completely never existed. Bobby Badiahawa never existed at all. You know, uh, there's this guy called William Campbell, never existed at all. So most of the characters in this book never existed at all. But just of course, you could say that my story and this story have got so much intersection. And then there is a lady called Laura Kalin. Now that one suddenly a big part of my existed. That Laura is a girl that I was really, really obsessed with in my teenagers. I mean, I say Laura Karinji, but that's not the real name. There is another name, but the person, same person. Yeah, so that girl, continue calling her Laura. Now she's a woman, a good woman, with maybe big girls, uh, big daughters. But that woman, Laura Karinji, uh, when I first learned of her, I got obsessed with her from the start. I had not seen her even. I just have guys talking about her. Just joined senior one at Inter School, and some of my classmates they were talking about a girl that they had been with at school, at proper school, Laura. And they talked about her as someone who was so special, someone who was out of this world. And I thought at that time, maybe I still do, but at that time I certainly still think that I was out of this world, that I was a genius, that I was someone special. And I thought this Laura they're talking about and me were naturally matched. And so even before I saw Laura, I decided that she was the girl of my dreams, she was the girl that I was going to pursue. And That, it began in that, small way and serious way, but it became something serious. Because of as the teams were on, I got really serious. I got completely obsessed with Laura. And so 11 years later, 2002, when I had completed university and I just began work and couldn't even hold down a job because of this total obsession, I wrote a poem that I initially entitled Laura My Lab and My Campus Hero. It was a long, long poem that went up to about 300 pages. And after writing that poem, I didn't know what to do with it. I read this and I thought it's a beautiful poem. And the few people who got to read it, including some lady who had written a powerful play that was talking a lot about churches, Languna and such, and something like that. They told me, oh, this is a very beautiful piece of work. So it was, I really thought so. I thought it was a powerful poem. 300 pages, all about this Laura obsession. I was just trying to process my thoughts so that I could identify where all this obsession had started from, how it had grown, how it had consumed me. I wanted to identify, the stakes in the whole thing. Because, I'd studied math, physics, then at university, civil engineering. So I understood the whole thing, the processes, that things usually have a process that they go through. So this whole obsession of love, I was trying to take it through the same analysis to understand where it had come from, what factors driven it, how it had come to consume me to some degree, to the degree that it had consumed me. And after writing the poem, it was not there like saying that people are praising me, the people who read it, and I myself thought it was a great work of poetry, but I couldn't publish it. I couldn't put it out there. I couldn't, put it in public because I was not in a relationship with Laura. And it would have been a little weird for me to publish a poem like that about a guy that I was not in a relationship with. So I now had a poem, a beautiful poem, I thought, but which I didn't know what to do with. And I agonized over that for about 4 years. Agonized over what to do with the poem. And then after about 4 years, I got this idea that I could pick out some of the parts of the poem and insert them into a fiction. In other words, that I could write a fiction and pick out some parts, some of the poem, some of the lines that I liked, that I appreciated the most in the poem, in the long poem. I pick them out and I insert them into a fiction. And that's what I did. I wrote a fiction, which is just a duo, and I inserted some of the poems from the other original poem. I set them into this book. So I can read for you, for example, one of the poems from the original long poem. The original long poem was entitled "Laura My Love" or uh, "My Compasura." Sometimes I would call it "Laura My Love." Sometimes I would call it "My Compasura." If I had published it, I don't know what title I would have used for it. But here's the thing. This is, for example, a poem from book. This is about God. Again and again, I tried to convince myself that it's over. I should move on. That the old man should forget about that rather than cry what he cannot get. But my attempts failed and failed again. To erase her from my head and mind, I might push away with my hand, or quicken my stay and push the language, or use a whole glue to effort, but fail to forget the Laura of my dream. That is a poem that I wrote here. It was partly inspired by the Pithy story, the old man and the dad. I don't know whether you still remember that story, whether you studied it at all. Yeah, but in Pithy, there was that story of the old man called it down, and then the dad told him, I can, tell you three things that can make you the richest man in the world. And the man said, okay, you tell me those things. And that I've told him the first thing is never let go what you already have. And then the second thing, never cry for what you cannot get. And then he told him the third thing, I'm going to tell you the third thing, if you let me go to a branch yonder. And he really did go to the branch. And when he gets to the branch, he asks him, what was the first thing I told you? He said, the first thing he told me was never let go what you already have. Then he asked him, so why did you let me go? And then the man begins to cry. The bad asks him, what is the second thing I told you? Never cry for what you cannot get. So that was a quick story, but it's partly what inspired me as I was writing this poem. Again and again, I tried to commit myself. All right, so the poems of this nature, I've written a long poem of about 100 words, that's over 10 pages rather, of this kind about my relationship with Laura, how she had become my obsession for longer than a decade. And I now picked some parts of those poems, and inserted them into the story. I also picked out parts of the story that the real story just or rather of Laura to me parts of it, just a few parts of it, which are relevant to the narrative. In other words, I created a structure. I created a new structure, a fictional structure, and then I inserted uh, the parts of the truth that that were relevant or that were helpful or that were effective as far as the communication of the message was concerned. And the message was peculiar parts, peculiar path, peculiar purpose. So that was the purpose of writing the book, to communicate that message. And then I invented characters, invented events, and then I added in some of the events that were true and some of the poems that were truly inspired by Laura. And then set them into all that, basically fabricated this whole thing. And it's that thing that became known as Jessel Joe. Uh, it got me uh, so many good reviews. I've told you personal shares review, but there was so many other good reviews. You can find some of them, through Google. You can do Google search, you just listen to it in Mexico. You'll probably find some reviews, good reviews really, that there are, that made me happy. And the book won an award, National Book Prize, National Book Trust of Uganda. They used to give awards in their notice, and it won the award in 2008. So it's a book that and me some bit of some bit of some bit of satisfaction, and also some of the reviews. For example, Dennis Munzai, he got in his review in the Sunday Monitor, he got reading the book, he wondered whether I would be the man to write the Great Uganda novel, and that encouraged me to write another book. That and some other things. They encouraged me to write another book. So, which was called, which again, I, is another story. You can also read reviews of Chess Code through Google. All right. So, what I'm trying to tell you then is that the Jesus Jew, this is a book that sprung out of the life experiences, like what Dan was writing about. Dan was writing about my struggles with love, that poem that I read at the beginning. And so it was this whole obsession with love that was the root uh, of this novel. But in the end, the novel that I wrote was, it took a life of its own, took a philosophy of its own, and it only got the parts of Laura that were relevant to that philosophy, that were relevant to that purpose. And it became a book with a different meaning. So, from the real life experience.